All right, thanks very much. So I'm glad I got to see Amos's talk yesterday, because they kind of changed a little bit how the direction I'm going down, because I realized you guys are getting a good overview of data assimilation here in general. And so I can kind of tell a little bit more about the things that are unique to the kind of inversions that we're doing from the atmosphere, and also the specific problems that we have with satellite data. Problems and opportunities, I'll say. And we've also seen a version of this plot earlier today as well. So I think that Sean had the 2006 version up. This is from Friedingstein et al., and this is from the CMIP5 intercomparison. So we saw this before. It's looking at all of the different land surface models, and if they run them forward in a climate model, what they have as projections. And on the left, we have ocean, and this is the cumulative fluxes on the top, and the annual fluxes on the bottom. And you see the ocean is comparatively well constrained. I mean, there's still quite a lot of spread going out to 2100, but the land is all over the place. This is like the real spaghetti plot that is kind of worrying us. This is the carbon climate feedbacks that we don't understand all that well. And here the lines are colored, you can maybe kind of see, where the land use change is prescribed. They tend to be very, very high. And I'm going to mention the flux here is the opposite sign to how I normally think of flux. This is how land people think of flux. So this means way more uptake. Yeah? So this is not flux into the atmosphere. This is flux into the land biosphere. And if they're nitrogen limited, they tend to be slightly losing carbon. So that's the difference with the blue lines. And the black lines are a little bit all over the place. So there is some differences based on how the models are structured. But the main thing is there's a lot of uncertainty. And I'm mentioning this because this is sort of the motivation for why we want to learn more through inverse modeling, so that we can say from an independent source of information, we're pretty sure that this is a source right now, or this is a sink right now, and this is what the internal variability looks like. And then if you have independently a process model, a bottom-up model that gets the same patterns, we're more confident that we're doing it right. So I mentioned this sort of nomenclature the other day, talking about how we do satellite data in my field, how we call our L1s and L2s. And this was mentioning that column average abundances and XCO2, and that atmospheric conversion brings you to the fluxes. But I should mention, of course, that also in situ mixing ratio measurements also bring us to the fluxes. But then we don't call them L2, so it still says L2 here. But it's just to say, like, it's not only satellite data that give us information from the fluxes. We're using both forms of information. And L3 data is kind of like the optimized fields, right? This is sort of a way of doing it, but that's kind of more like going in this direction. Because you can't gap fill in situ mixing ratio measurements. The gaps are just far too big. So really that arrow should probably be going more that way. But this is what we're after. So I talked a lot about the measurements and the signals we see in the measurements, but what we're really after is the fluxes. This is where the scientific questions are. We don't actually want just to have really nice maps of the concentrations. We want to know how that ties into what's going on at the surface. This is where the policy relevant information is. This is how we can improve our models, improve our climate predictions. And this is sort of a special thing related to remote sensing. So if you're kind of working on a new satellite, designing a new satellite mission, you have these mission requirement documents that drive how the instrument has to be built. And these define what you need at level 2. And then they go backwards, and that defines what you need at level 1. And so it kind of gives you an idea on what you need at level 0, so what you need sort of from an instrumentation level. But in the case of greenhouse gases, at least, these are really driven by level 4, which is actually officially external to what the deliverable of the satellite mission is. So it's kind of this weird problem where we have almost inverse modeling going on before the mission even starts, to say, we want to know this about the fluxes, what do we have to have as a measurement, and what do we have to have then as a precision on our sensors. So, yeah, so defining these user requirements usually involves a lot of iterative inverse modeling in meetings. And I mentioned this left side came up before, because I said it's a lot like satellite retrieval, because I know there are some people here who are working in satellite retrieval. And I said, basically, atmospheric conversion is the same mathematical problem, we just have different models. So they're both optimal estimation. And instead of using a radiative transfer model as your forward model, you have an atmospheric transport model. Your prior is not the state of the atmosphere, but rather the state of the fluxes. So you have your prior estimate of the fluxes. Then you run that forward with your transport and get a concentration field. And this is your first guess of the concentrations. Sorry. And then you can adjust the surface fluxes and other elements of your state vector until you can minimize this difference, the difference between your modeled concentrations and your measured concentrations. And this is sort of where the Bayesian statistics come in that we saw. I'm supposed to be using this. That's where the Bayesian statistics come in. Okay, so to talk about what our forward model is, I'm not going to go into a lot of discussion about this, but I think you guys have all an idea roughly of how atmospheric transport models work. So generally, we're talking about global Eulerian models. Eulerian meaning we have grid boxes and the air travels through the grid boxes. Okay? They can be run online so that you have all of the physics computed online, and that's like, so numerical weather prediction models have that, right? Where they're actually solving the equations for the fluid dynamics online. Or they are run offline, and that's like the model that I use usually is offline. The model that most people are using at this point for global flux inversions are offline. What you do then is you take meteorology from one of these numerical weather prediction models. Usually we use reanalysis fields, and we take the input that we need to run our models. We need things like wind, temperature, humidity, height, pressure, all the stuff that we need kind of to say where the air is moving. And we feed it into this offline model that can be run much more quickly, so you don't have to do all of the physics online. There's still sometimes a parameterization of some subgrid scale processes, but this is actually even becoming less now that, for instance, ECMWF is saving their vertical mass fluxes. They didn't used to, so we have to do all our convection offline. And just to give an idea of the kind of thing that when you do your convection offline, if you have this, or online, you have this sort of parameterization, then you have to kind of take into account how much is going between each layer in a sort of iterative way. And this would be done as a pre-processing step. But it just, so the idea is that you have a model that's able to take fluxes, input or taken out from the surface, and transport this mass, and it has to be conserved. So we need to conserve mass, or else we can't really use it for the kind of modeling that we're doing. Because if every time you lose or gain a little bit of mass and you're doing maybe 80 iterations to get at your fluxes, then you no longer have the right amount of mass in the atmosphere, and it doesn't make any sense. So mass conservation is very important, which also not all numerical weather prediction models conserve mass. So I'm only doing a little bit of math, 3 slides with math on it. So our forward model, we're starting with our concentrations from the model is our transport operator, that's what this A is here, times our fluxes, and plus some sort of initial background concentration. And then in our case, you can do different ways of kind of describing your fluxes. We describe our flux model into a fixed term and then something else that gets scaled. So your P is sort of what you're actually solving for. And then this F has different shape files, sort of distributions in space, and also different frequency components. So we add up a whole bunch of these Fs and Ps. So say we might have, 2 seasonal components, and then we'll have another longer interannual, we'll have a few harmonics that can do interannual variability. So it's a way of reducing the number of things you have to solve for. Different models set this up differently. This is a way to do it. And then we have some assumptions about our p-values, these scaling values that we're actually going to be solving for, that they have 0 mean. Oh, I'm still using this. Okay, that they have 0 mean, and that this mu is a scaling factor that kind of says how much weight we're going to be giving to our prior information, which is nice because it means you only have to do the inversion once, the expensive computation, and then you can just do the last reprocessing step and change your mu and say, what if we gave the prior more weight or less weight? So it allows you to do some sensitivity functions. Okay, so again, we're assuming everything's Gaussian, and then we have our unconditional probability distribution that looks like this. And this is very similar to something that we saw yesterday. So this is a Gaussian kind of relationship. And this is the mismatch term that we're trying to minimize. So this is the mismatch we want to get it to, we want to make it smaller within the uncertainties of our setup. So this is the difference between our observations and our modeled concentrations. And then what we really want to do is use the probability. This is the probability distribution, a conditional probability distribution. So that means what's the probability expectation value sort of P given this mismatch. And I just repeated it here. So this gives us then what our cost function looks like. And I'm not going into how we minimize it because I think that we're going to learn about that better. But essentially the first term is the observational constraint. This is where your mismatches are. And the second term is your prior constraint. This is where you're putting in the knowledge of what you think it's going to look like. So say you're pretty sure that you know the phase of the seasonal cycle. You're pretty sure that you know that there's going to be more fluxes in the tropics. This kind of thing goes in there. And this QM, this is our error covariance matrix. And this is sort of where the art comes in, because there's not a completely hard and fast analytical way of doing this. Because what gets packed into there is things like, what is my transport uncertainty? What is the uncertainty on my measurement? That part's relatively clear. And then is there correlations in the transport uncertainty on distinctive measurements? And of course there's correlation if you have two measurements close in space and time. But very often we assume that it's diagonal and that they're uncorrelated, which is not entirely true. So there's other ways of de-weighting it. But this is sort of where the fine art comes in. So then we have this cost function, we want to find the minimum. And we heard about this also yesterday. So if we have small enough matrices, then we can use an analytical solution. Like if you have a matrix that you can actually hold in memory and that you can do operations on, then everything is purely analytical. And this is something that could still be done analytically. This is the coarse grid of our model. And this is 8 by 10 degrees in space. And vertically, I think there's not many levels, maybe 9 levels. And you could do monthly fluxes. You could solve for monthly fluxes on this. This is how big a matrix we can hold. But this is not what we want, right? So this is what we did until we said, yeah, we need better. And then you move to a variational approach. And we heard some more about that yesterday. I'm sure we're going to hear more. Variational approaches often require an adjoint version of the transport model. And I'll talk a little bit in a second what the adjoint is. The adjoint is kind of like the backwards version of your model. And it's useful because in your matrix calculation, it means that your computing and memory costs don't have to be as big as the number of measurements. So if you have a lot of measurements, an adjoint is saving you a lot of computational time and space. But this also means you have to have an adjoint of your model. And I think I discussed that in a second. So others use something like the ensemble-Kalman filter. So where you don't necessarily need an adjoint, but you have to have many, many forward iterations to kind of create this ensemble. This is another example of one that is solved with an analytical solution. So LMDZ is the model used by the French group at LSE. They have their standard model, uses a variational approach, not unlike ours, but they also have a version of it that runs analytically where they've grouped the sort of surface areas into 200 regions, where the ocean regions are a bit bigger, and they can solve for 48 flux time periods per year. It's nice sometimes being able to have something like this that can be run because it lets you test some things and make sure, for instance, if you're estimating your uncertainties a different way, with this kind of model, with this kind of analytical solution, you can solve for your uncertainties exactly. So it has some benefits. So what is an adjoint? I think I can probably play this, just because it gives you something nice to look at. An adjoint of a transport model lets it run backwards in time. Most of these models are written in Fortran, which might scare people who are not used to doing big computations, because everyone's like, what, don't you use Python or something? No, because Fortran's fast. It is really, really fast when you have really, really big number crunching to do. We might have a Python wrapper on it to make a nicer front end, but it's Fortran. So because we have this relatively simple code where there's not a lot of things like pointers and It's unfancy code. It's pretty easy, actually, to do automatic differentiation to get a tangent linear version of the code. And that lets you also make an automatic adjoint. So this is really computational stuff. I'm not a computer scientist. I can do my adjoint calculations by hand when I have to change small things, but you should talk to someone who knows more about this than me if you have questions. Yeah, but it lets you calculate the footprints or the flux sensitivities for each location. Now, another way of doing this is with something called the Lagrangian model. So I mentioned the Eulerian models where you have a box and the air passes through the box. The other option is Lagrangian model, where instead of calculating the transport everywhere, you follow a particle or you follow a parcel of air. So it is advected through, and there's a number of Lagrangian type models. So Lagrangian particle dispersion models will have many, many particles that are released, and then they have some sort of stochastic random walk type thing that accounts for turbulence. So they diffuse in a somewhat realistic way. So some examples you might have heard of are like high split, flex part, NAME is the UK model, STILT is the one that we use and that's used at Harvard. So this shows a simulation with STILT. And what they're doing here is you release the particles backwards in time from your measurement site. So here we have a tall tower in eastern Poland at Białystok, and we release particles, and then you see where they go backwards in time, and that's your area of influence. So what's shown here is the footprint, so that's when they come close to the surface, in the lower half of the planetary boundary layer. And we say, okay, that's when they're influenced by the fluxes. So this is a way of calculating what flux influence you're seeing with this concentration measurement. So this gives you something in ppms per micromole per meter second squared, if that makes some sense. So it's another way of doing an adjoint. Okay, so then we need priors, right? We have to have our first guess. And usually we use bottom-up estimates for this. I just threw a few examples up here. This is EDGAR is often used for anthropogenic emissions, mostly because it's global and not much else is. So that's a huge benefit to this. It's global and it also does more than one species. So there's a couple other global products just for carbon dioxide. But if you're interested in doing carbon dioxide and methane and carbon monoxide and maybe joint inversions, you need something that's sort of consistent and global if you're doing global runs. Yeah, that's developed by the Joint Research Council. So it's a European product. There's also then your land biosphere fluxes from process-based models, or you can just maybe use their distribution and variability. You can use information from them. You're not going to say, I trust this and I think this is true, but it gives you an idea of what is your range of uncertainty in different places. You can even use kind of an ensemble of different land biosphere models and say, okay, this is the area where they disagree the most, so I think that this is where I have to put the biggest uncertainty in my model, because this is where we have the least secure knowledge. And then, of course, we need something for ocean fluxes, and they're usually based on measurements of PCO2 in the ocean water, and then also ocean models. So Takahashi is sort of the climatology that everyone's been using forever, and we're slowly moving towards some things that have a bit more interannual variability, like Christian Rodenbeck has a product and Landschutzer et al. So these are based on a longer period of measurements of PCO2. But these measurements are shipboard measurements, and they're still quite sparse in space. So we might not be getting the full variability, but it's the best we have. And finally, one other thing that we have to take into account is we're not usually solving for fluxes at every pixel and at every time step, certainly, but even every day. In order to reduce the dimensionality of our problem, and also to get results that make more sense, we often introduce spatial and temporal correlations in our fluxes. So for instance, if you're looking at the land biosphere fluxes, you don't expect it to be incredibly huge uptake one day and then negative uptake as in only respiration the next day and then going back. This is not what we see in nature. So we say, okay, we see in nature that there is some correlation between in time and in space. So we often use something like an E-folding length of about a month, and like 500 or 1,000 kilometers for land biosphere fluxes, and longer correlation lengths for the ocean. So, and this is also, if you look through the literature, different groups choose different things, but yeah, you can do sensitivity tests and see, what if I change this? How sensitive am I to this? Is the result robust? Or, yeah. So again, the posterior uncertainties, if we had matrix inversions, if we had the biggest memories in the world, then we would be able to analytically calculate the posterior uncertainties, which is really nice. Variational approaches, depending on how they're organized, may not be able to solve them exactly, and may sometimes use then like a Monte Carlo-like approach to estimate uncertainties based on doing things like perturbing the prior. So, all right, and this is the kind of output that we get. And I'm sorry, this is kind of a lot of lines here, but it's just to give you an idea about how the uncertainties look by region. So here we see the global total. The uncertainty is in gray, and you'll see that there's almost no uncertainty. The different colored lines here are just for different lengths of data set. So it's also different lengths of inversion. So this is stations that have existed since 1981. This is stations that have existed since 1985, since 1990, and so on. We get kind of edge effects when you add stations in part way. So each of these is one run for the whole length of the relatively continuous data records. So there's more stations included in the magenta line, for instance. This is the most recent and the shortest data records. This is all stations that have existed since 2004. And when you add new stations and start to get very big differences, then you say, okay, either I wasn't resolving something before or my model can't reproduce this very well, but it tells you that maybe you're gaining information that you didn't have before. Like for instance, the magenta one that you see in North American temperate has very, very different behavior in some years. And I probably should have introduced the Transcom regions first, but that map comes later. So what you'll see is globally we have very, very good uncertainty. For the land total, also, we're relatively confident, because this is just the uncertainty on the partitioning between all land and all ocean. And then when you go down to the regional scales, often the uncertainty gets a little bit bigger. You also get bigger uncertainty in places where you don't have as many measurements, which often is the tropics. Yeah, but it's just to give you sort of an idea. This is focusing on interannual variability. Interannual variability is very interesting because it gives you an idea about what climate anomalies do. So if you have, for instance, a very, very dry summer somewhere, then you can look and say, okay, what did that do to the fluxes? That's sort of an example of what we might use that for. I have just a couple examples from the literature just to show you what people are doing. And I don't know if Jochen is still there. Yes, you are. Because this is actually one of the papers. I want to talk to you about this later, because there are a lot of groups in my field who are using sun-induced fluorescence as linearly equal to GPP for partitioning. And I've complained about it for a long time, but I've just kind of given up because it kind of seems to work, but I think it's not really true. So I want to talk to you more about that. So this is one of these papers. This is from Junji Liu, and it's using OCO2 data and GOSAT data. And what they did is compared the 2015 El Nino to the 2011 La Nina and tried to get partitioning about what was happening differently in these years in these three tropical regions. And you'll see that they do the partitioning into GPP, among others. And they're getting this GPP really based on sun-induced fluorescence. And they're saying this is the difference in GPP. So it's widely done, and in some fields it's somewhat more accepted. But yeah, and you see for the difference between these three, it's kind of interesting because you can look at what are the climate drivers of it. Like, they were all warmer, but the precipitation was close to normal in Africa, and as a result you end up with different kinds of drivers. So I'm not going to go deep into the analysis, but just to give you an idea of why we're looking at these fluxes and what we're trying to explain. And this is another nice paper that leaned heavily on GOSAT data, and actually it was great because the inversions couldn't see this at all using only the surface data, even though we think that Australia is well enough constrained because there's a few stations around it and it's in the middle of the Southern Ocean, so it's in the Southern Hemisphere at least, so it has a pretty quiet background. But the surface stations could not see that in 2010, 11, there was really way more uptake than usual and seen by GOSAT. And this was confirmed by other things, by looking at things like the NDVI, that really there was more rain than usual and everything was growing. And this flux was real, and it was not shown, it didn't show up in the CASA models. This is sort of like the land biosphere model. So this is something where you can say, hey, why can't you see that? Like, what couldn't you see? You have, so CASA is using FPAR. They should be able to see this, and why are they not able to? So this is where you can really go into specific events and work to improve your biosphere models. Okay, so this is the transcom regions I should have shown you before. We're usually at this point trying to get fluxes roughly on pixel scale. Pixels from different models means anything from sort of 2 degrees to 5 degrees or so, global boxes, yeah? So, I mean, this is still not city scale or anything. We can't do that globally yet. But this is kind of the scale that people are working at. When you want to compare them to each other, instead of comparing my pixel box to your pixel box, because there's still a fair bit of uncertainty in the fine structure, we tend to aggregate into bigger common areas so that it's an easier number to compare, a more robust number to compare. So these are the transcom regions that are still really widely used in the literature, and it's from like this intercomparison project from, I think, 2003. And I have this map up in my office, but I don't even need it because I know them all off by heart because I use them so much. So it's a useful shorthand, and you'll see that even on some of the plots coming up from published papers that this is the order we plot our regions in, which makes not a lot of sense. But okay, so for the regional flux distribution, this is a quote from, so Christian Rödenbeck works at my institute, and he actually sort of built the inversion model before I got there even. So this is from his paper in 2003. This is completely true. So in contrast to temporal variations, the long-term spatial flux distribution can be inferred with lesser robustness only. So we're pretty sure about things changing from year to year, but to say actually, yeah, this is on average a sink and this is on average a source, especially if they're next to each other, it's difficult to say completely robustly. And one of the hopes with satellite data, because we're getting so much more coverage between the gaps, is that we could say, yeah, this is a source or this is a sink. And this has been more complicated than you might imagine. So this is still quite a burning question in the field. So here you see an intercomparison of different models. So my model here is in red, but these are the different groups. Yeah? And it's the recap synthesis. So you see we all agree quite well for the global total flux, and well, we should, because if you're conserving mass, this should be more or less right. And then, as I said, you break it up into land and ocean, and still everyone, except for maybe this outlier, is still more or less agreeing. Now we're going to break it up some more. And so now here we have the northern hemisphere, the tropics, and the southern hemisphere. And I lost my labels, but this is the same as before. So it's total land and ocean. So this is the total flux, land flux, and ocean flux. And you see already here, we're getting some serious disagreement. So this is the tropical land. So it seems that the tropical land looks like mostly, sometimes actually a really big source, and sometimes it's carbon neutral and maybe even a little sink. So this is a big disagreement about a big and very active part of the carbon cycle. And this kind of tells you that there are some weaknesses in our top-down methodology that we can't get this agreement on even fairly broad scales. Now this is the northern hemisphere land. Okay, and if you break this down into subregions, North America, Europe, and Northern Asia, again, you see we're getting more disagreement, where we're not even agreeing on the sign necessarily. So is Europe a sink? And is Europe a big sink? We'll see more about that. So kind of remember where the line is here for 1 petagram of carbon sink. Some models are getting that already from this is all based on surface data. This is all based on surface data, everything you're seeing here. There's no satellite data in this. Now, there's this kind of ongoing debate about the tropics versus the northern hemisphere land. Which one is a source and which one is a sink, and how big is this split? And so there was this paper in Science in 2007 that used aircraft data and said, you know, this is a vertical mixing problem. This is the transport problem. So if we have models that can better represent the vertical gradients in the concentrations, then they're probably going to be more correct. And so what they did is plotted here the northern land versus the tropical land, and this is whether you get the gradient right. And if you're in the gray bar, then you're matching the vertical gradient in the aircraft data. So the ones that best matched this tended to have less northern hemisphere uptake and a weaker source in the tropics. So they said that's probably true, because these are the ones that are getting the transport most correct. I'm not entirely convinced, but... And then some ocean guys came and looked at this. This is a paper from Sarmiento et al. And they said, what if we take the same data, the same models, and add a stronger ocean constraint? Because they let their oceans move too much, and we know a lot about the ocean. And we're pretty sure that the oceans should be more fixed than they are. And they split these into the Stevens subset. So this is the ones that Stevens said were compliant, and the ones that based on just atmospheric inversion, and they made them both into joint inversions, and they said, look at when you take the ocean into account, everyone agrees. And when everyone agrees, then the northern hemisphere is actually a bigger sink. And so they were saying, no, the Stevens idea was wrong. And this is still, so this contradicts the tropical sink proposed by Stevens, but this doesn't end. Okay. And this is a plot that is in our field sometimes referred to as the diver down plot. And I don't know if anybody here scuba dives or scuba dives in the Americas, because I think the flags here are different. But this is what a diver down flag looks like. So if a diver is underwater, they have to put this flag so that you know someone is diving. And this flag looks something like this plot. So this is our diver down plot. And based on mass balance, only this white stripe can be true, because we know how much carbon is in the atmosphere. So if the northern extratropical land carbon flux is going in this direction, this one has to be going in this direction. They have to stay on that stripe, or else it's no longer physically consistent. And so this is a paper from Dave Schimmel and his group, and they were arguing that multiple data streams suggest that you have to end up here. So the recap results that I was just showing you are in purple, and they're kind of spread out. They're not just there. The original Stevens study, the original Transcom ones are here, and they're saying to be compliant, they have to be here. Deforestation data suggests that it's here using land surface models. If you include the CO2 effect, it brings you to here. It has to be here. And it's actually quite a well-written paper, and you kind of end up convinced. But a lot of models get different results that seem to be completely consistent with the atmospheric measurements. And so now what happens if we add satellites? So this was the first big GOSAT intercomparison study. And this was a whole bunch of groups that are running inversions with surface measurements and with GOSAT satellite measurements, and saying what happens when we add the satellite data. So here we had our prior, and we're only looking at the northern hemisphere extratropical land here, and this is just the tropical land. So northern hemisphere, tropics, land. And this is the FLASK data, meaning the in situ data, the land-based surface measurements. And you see, okay, they suggest that there's sort of a moderate northern hemisphere land sink and a small tropical land source. Then you add the satellites, and you have a massive northern hemisphere land sink and a massive tropical source. And this was hard to reconcile with what's going on here. So suppose we look at put the average of these guys onto this plot. Then we start with our prior. The prior is over here, so it's on the stripe, but it's not where Dave Schimmel says we should be. Then we add the FLASK data, and we end up right here in the middle of what other FLASK inversions have done, which seems to make sense. Then we add the satellite data, and we move further away from where we're supposed to be. Okay, so it seems the satellite data is really suggesting, no, there's a bigger northern hemisphere sink, and there's a bigger tropical source. So this was already seen with the first major publication. This is a one model publication of the GOSAT data. And again, you have FLASKs in green here and GOSAT in red. And where you see the biggest differences are Africa and Europe. Another study with two different models, and you see the biggest differences for Africa, giant source, and Europe, giant sink. Giant sink of more than 1 petagram of carbon. They therefore suggested that the high spatial density of the satellite data exacerbated the impact of regional biases of the transport models and of the retrievals. They said it's all bias. And some of it might have been bias. In that version of the data, there was problems with the North African measurements from sand contamination. So that got a bit better. It kind of looks like a dipole, though, right? If you have like a big sink in Europe and a big source in Northern Africa, we get dipoles in this kind of model when you can't tell these two regions apart from the transport. So you know roughly how much mass has to be coming out of here, but you can't say for sure how much of it's coming out of here and how much is coming out of there. So a dipole is when you end up getting kind of a high and a low right next to each other, and you think, that doesn't look physical, I'm probably not resolving it. This is what we mean by a dipole. And the fact that we're seeing anomalous results from these two regions made people sort of suspicious. But then there was this nice regional study that was looking only at Europe and using satellite data. And it was using Carbon Tracker, which is based only on surface data, as its boundary condition. And it also had a massive European sink of about a petagram. And a regional study shouldn't have a dipole coming from Africa because it's using something that doesn't have this dipole as a boundary condition. It's only using the information inside. So it's saying, no, we really think that this European sink is real. And this was hugely controversial because we have more measurements in Europe than almost anywhere else, right? We have flux towers. We've done the Carbo Europe project. We think we know what the carbon budget of Europe is in a normal year. And he's saying, yeah, when you look at it with satellites, it's 2 to 3 times as big every year. And this sort of new, timey measurement maybe is not to be trusted, said the others. So this is a paper by Max Reuter. And then he kind of doubled down on this. And I say he, but I'm a co-author, whatever. But so I also doubled down on this and said there's other there's other sources of information that suggest that this could be true. So bottom up says, this is the European carbon budget. Bottom up says it should be maybe a sink of something like 0.2, 0.3. So gigatons of carbon and petagrams of carbon are the same. I just like to say petagrams. And the global in situ inversions based on surface data says it's a little bit bigger, but with some spread. And these are all from satellites. All the ones in blue are satellite-based studies. And they all say, no, it's 1 petagram. And so we kind of looked around and say, what could be the explanation for this? And it might be also to see, this is the region where the largest sink was suggested by the Reuters study. Sort of northeastern Europe, which is where we don't have as many measurements. So this is really kind of Western Russia. And it's saying, actually, what we're seeing is a big sink in what Europe isn't monitoring all that well, and downwind of what Europe is monitoring better. So maybe the satellites really are seeing this better. And this was kind of semi-confirmed by microwave satellite data that was measuring changes in biomass over on a decadal scale, saying, yeah, there probably is a lot of uptake there, and this maybe is regrowth of Western Russian forests that is not being seen by measurement stations in Western Europe. So this was quite exciting. I mean, this paper was just published last year. This is it's an ongoing hot topic. But, so is it a sampling bias? We're going to test and say, does that mean maybe the surface stations just can't see the truth? There aren't enough of them. Or is GOSAT somehow not seeing things properly because it's not measuring in the wintertime? Yeah? So we can test this by using pseudo-observations. So consider that we have the following networks. Imagine we have the sort of standard surface stations. And one of the hypotheses is also, you have problems in the tropics because you don't have any measurements. Well, this is a synthetic observation study, so we're going to make a bunch of measurements in the tropics. We're just going to add 12 stations to the tropics, because we can do that. And then, or we sample it like GOSAT, or then we say, what if GOSAT didn't need the sun, really? And kind of superimpose the June measurements and the December measurements on top of each other. And so we have sort of southern hemisphere December and northern hemisphere June. And say that's kind of like if GOSAT were active, if GOSAT could see in the opposite season, what kind of results would we get? So we want to see, can the satellite sampling reproduce the inferred surface-based fluxes? Or can the surface sampling reproduce the inferred satellite-based fluxes? So for this, we're going to first test the surface network. So we treat our GOSAT-derived fluxes as the truth. So these are fluxes that are consistent with our prior uncertainties, but it's what GOSAT says is the most likely solution. Then we run our true fluxes forward, sample at where there's surface sites, and then we invert these synthetic observations and see what do we get. And so in this plot here, you see for the different regions, our truth is in green, and our surface sampling and our surface plus 12 tropical stations are in orange and brown, respectively. Adding 12 tropical stations did almost nothing. It changed a little bit in South Africa and South American temperate, but it did almost nothing, which is kind of surprising. But more importantly, even with adding more stations, the surface network cannot reproduce the GOSAT fluxes. So GOSAT's saying there's huge North African fluxes, the surface station can't see them. There's also a bigger sink in Australia and Europe, the surface station can't see them. So this could be something that can't be monitored from the ground with the current station network. But then we have to ask it in reverse. Let's test the satellite data. Can the satellites see it? So now we're going to say the surface-derived fluxes are true. We run our true fluxes forward, sample them at satellite locations, and invert these synthetic observations. And okay, good, you can read that there. Yellow is always tricky. And what we see, so our truth now is blue, and the GOSAT sampling is yellow, and the GOSAT sampling does not do very well in the far north, which isn't hugely surprising because we're not measuring a lot in the winter. But the active light GOSAT sampling is actually pretty good. So it's within uncertainty. I didn't put the uncertainty bars on the plot, but it's within uncertainty. Oh, look at Europe is perfectly matched, and so are most other regions. So Eurasian temperate is a bit strange, but and this really suggests that the seasonal difference in sampling makes it hard for the passive sampling to get it right, but the additional coverage of GOSAT actually means it can see what's going on, assuming that the measurements aren't biased. So, but there's another kind of sampling bias, which is troublesome for satellites, and this is a clear sky bias, right? Because we can only measure when there aren't clouds. So kind of imagine, assuming you're not limited by anything else, assuming you have enough water, most plants are going to have an increase in uptake when there's more sunlight, right? This is where you get the diurnal cycle of GPP. So then you have a bigger sort of negative change in the XCO2. And if it's very cloudy, then you have less surface radiation and you have a decrease in GPP. Yes, under conditions with slightly more diffuse radiation, like with aerosols, you can actually boost GPP, but it's still light dependent. And this is like a light limitation I'm talking about. You have clouds, there's less light. So we can test this by using the upscaled flux product from Fluxcom. And this is driven by reanalyzed surface radiation. So these model fluxes do respond to cloud cover. So you see really cloud in it. And you can shuffle the location of our observations, move them around so that they're either in sunny or cloudy pixels. So we kind of say, what if we break them up into 64 big-ish regions? This is not our model boxes, it's just big-ish regions, and then say, okay, here's the original GOSAT measurements for one day. This is the sunny ones, so they're yellow, so they're on yellow. It's hard to see maybe. But they kind of stay roughly where they are, which makes sense because they're already measuring where it's sunny. And then we move them to cloudy areas. So they all have the same number of measurements, but whether they're in the cloud or in the sun. And so I should just say that most people thought that this was going to not make a difference at all. Because, yeah, we take account of the transport. And we're assimilating them at the right time in the right place. But if you still have a consistent difference in your distribution, it does matter unless your model is resolving clouds. So this is in review right now. So, but what we see is the difference between cloudy and sunny is that the sunny ones have a stronger uptake generally, so in Europe, for instance. So mostly in the extra tropics, you're going to get more uptake when it's sunny, and in the tropics, you get less. You get a larger source when it's sunny. And this is probably due to heat stress. So yeah, it kind of is pointing in the same direction. If you look, these are not massive fluxes. It's sort of a difference of like plus or minus 0.2 petagrams per year. But you have to remember that you have to sum across all of those to get these bars. And so it actually does make up for a lot of the difference that we're seeing in these plots. This doesn't matter for methane, because methane does not have this relationship to the sun. Methane has a relationship to temperature, but temperature does not change so quickly that it matters whether there's a cloud overhead or not. But GPP really does shut down that quickly. All right, and this kind of came up before in Sean's talk. He was saying about how all of these models that are just diagnosing based on measurements are not all that useful because you can't use them to improve your predictions. All of this is just describing the problem so far, but there is something called carbon cycle data assimilation systems, so we call it CCDAS. CCDAS does help us constrain climate predictions, because what it does is takes an Earth system model at the sort of core of it and assimilates a whole bunch of different data types, so not just concentrations. And this is a graphic from a kind of overview paper, because you can apply it to all sorts of different types of systems. But it's been used a few times for this kind of system, for the carbon cycle being constrained with atmospheric measurements. So there's a CCDAS example constraining land biosphere fluxes. And so what you're essentially optimizing is the parameters of your land surface model. So as opposed to optimizing the fluxes directly, you're saying, how do we tune these values to best match what we're seeing in the atmosphere? And this could be done with just carbon dioxide measurements, but in this case, it's done with carbon dioxide and FAPAR. And so this gives you a cost function that's made up of both your parameter priors and uncertainties, your carbon dioxide measurements. This is your prior constraint, your observational constraint from CO2, and your observational constraint from FAPAR. And it's kind of a fine art to balance the input from these multiple sources. But then it gives you your total cost function that needs to be fixed. There are some real benefits to this, because it means that you get an influence from a measurement that is not just in the local area. Normally, we're kind of constrained to where it touches, where you're seeing the surface. But this means, okay, if you trust your biosphere model and that this kind of land surface behaves like this under these conditions, and so I tune my parameter, that also affects the same kind of land surface over on this other continent. So you're improving things across the model from a limited series subset of measurements. It's also being used now for fossil fuel estimation. So instead of just a bookkeeping approach, which is kind of the standard one, this is a bit using some more inputs. So the input are things like national inventories, which are coming from the bookkeeping approach, but then trying to get the spatial distributions from things like night lights, power point locations, and population density. So it's sort of distributing based on different factors. And this allows you to kind of also project changes within a country. So. And this hasn't been done yet. This is a paper saying what could be done as a kind of CCDAS to constrain methane emissions. And we actually have a proposal in to do one small corner of this now, but yeah, we'll see. And so it's the idea of you can actually add in data streams to constrain all sorts of parts of this. So I mentioned before the OH problems, and it's saying, okay, we could put in things like methylchloroform or radiocarbon to try and constrain your lifetime. You can add other things to try and get your photochemistry correct. Most of these would not all be done simultaneously. Your atmospheric transport, obviously you're putting in your tracer there, but what if you also put in things to try and get your wetland model more correct? So instead of just having a fixed wetland map, say, what if I look at soil moisture, soil inundation, river runoff, and I try and assimilate all of these together to get an improved wetland model that matches best what we're seeing in the atmosphere. It's tricky with methane because all of the parts are very uncertain. So you can kind of try and fix one corner and maybe you match the concentrations sort of for the wrong reason. but yeah, so this is the idea of CCDAS. And the idea is that then when you end up with a wetland model that is more correct, you can use it for prediction with more faith. So you can optimize parameters. It improves your process models. It enables information to better inform the system globally and not just locally, and it can improve your forecasting in the terms of climate prediction. But the output has all of the structural errors of your process model, right? The one nice thing kind of from the sort of pure atmospheric inversion is you're not getting things wrong because your process model is wrong. And this kind of is going to be really tied to what's under the hood in your process model. And this is what I'm not talking about, because I realized I'm about on time. So what I'm not talking about today is retrieving emissions from point source imaging. And this is quite a new topic, sort of, in the field that I'm working in. And it's very interesting. What we've done so far is mostly stuff like Gaussian plume modeling. And you say, let's pretend that's kind of a Gaussian plume and fit it and do kind of an optimal estimation, and how big would that have to be, and estimate how dispersive the atmosphere is. And that part's pretty straightforward, but sometimes it breaks down. And when it breaks down, we don't have a lot of good option Bs. We can use Lagrangian methods, but there's other ones that are sort of mass balance approaches, like try and estimate how much mass is traveling at what speed downwind. If you have an image, you can do this a bit better. You're always tied to the wind speed as a big source of error. And then this is a nice new paper that's just out this year that is showing that for really high resolution, like the GHG sat that I showed yesterday for methane, which you're looking at like 20-meter sort of resolution, the Gaussian plume totally breaks down. So this is like a simulation from a large eddy simulation. So this is really like on the order of 20 meters or so, the individual data points. And this is what happens if you have like 3-kilometer pixels, okay? And this is the dependence on pixel size for how big your errors are. So if your pixel size is something like 7 kilometers, like this is where Sentinel-5P is, sort of, then, oh, actually Gaussian works not so bad. Then your root mean squared errors are, okay, 30% doesn't sound that great, but for one overpass, that's not the worst. But your errors are going up and up and up as your pixel size gets smaller. And your R squared of how well you can match the shape is going down and down and down. So here you're actually able to get, like 0.9 R squared by assuming it's Gaussian. But as you get to finer resolutions, these don't work anymore or don't work as well. So this is kind of a new field for us, and we're kind of looking into the literature to see how other people have done this, right? There's other people working in fluid dynamics on these scales, and that's not. But then, yeah, so even if we have the best method that works on this, can we do it globally for every point source if we have an imager that's measuring everywhere? And this is also a computational problem. So if we want to use like S5P data and look at all of the hotspots we see for methane, can we do that in a statistically consistent way with the global modeling, or do we have to do it as two completely separate processes? And this is still somewhat of an open question, which is why I'm not talking about it more, because I don't know the answer. So that's my conclusions. So inverse modeling, I think, is a powerful tool to solve for surface fluxes. We can estimate uncertainties in our posterior fluxes. It's complicated, but also gives you a lot of freedom in choosing your prior uncertainties, your prior fluxes, and the correlations between them. Agreement across models breaks down as you go to smaller scales, and there's still a lot of open questions. And incorporating satellite measurements in a consistent way is not straightforward. There are some projects going on right now who are trying different methods to see if we can improve this. And then CCDAS really offers a nice, powerful tool to improve model forecasts. But it is also computationally expensive. So thank you.
Many thanks for that. Are there any questions? Yeah, great.
You showed a graph where you included some microwave observations, of biomass, was it? Those wouldn't have a clear sky bias, would they? So would the reason that they were a bit closer to the surface measurements, would that?
But they weren't. They were closer to the satellite measurements.
Oh, they were, okay.
Yeah. Because there was an estimation of above ground carbon, and it was the trend, sort of the decadal trend.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was actually agreeing better with the satellite measurements. But you could kind of see like above ground carbon is like an integral of all the fluxes over 10 years. So yeah,
so it doesn't quite match.
Yeah, it doesn't quite match. It's not quite the same thing. That's measuring the pool and not the flux into the pool. If that, yeah? So, but it's somehow consistent. So the change in the pool.
Anyone else? Yeah.
I'm just wondering, in what cases would you solve for a global minimum and then for a local minimum?
Yeah.
And then secondly, does the minimization algorithm, does it need to be gradient-based or non-gradient-based?
So there are different answers to this problem. The one that we use is gradient-based, and we hope we get a global minimum. We have statistics that kind of help us tell how well it converges. So this is something that you can do and then also see if you let it run farther, is it staying in this minimum? So there are some tricks, but this is really like this is kind of a computer science or math question at that point. One thing I will mention is that the kind of most robust methods work very well for linear problems, and they still work for slightly nonlinear problems. And as you get more nonlinear problems, the minimization algorithms get more difficult and less stable. And actually, methane is a slightly nonlinear problem because of this thing. So, yeah.
you.